And welcome back to Open Studio. I'm Steve Leahy. This is the voiceover part two. Okay, I promise I'm going to put a sign up that says turn the microphone on. Anyway, um, here we are. So it's still about the details in this. I'm leaving the lower controls there and that running board with the rubber on it for the kind of last bit. It's a little bit different than the rest of it, being all rusty metal and worn and stuff. So it's going to take a little bit of a change of, I don't know, palette and figuring out to kind of get that right. So I'm saving the that rubber on the bottom for the end. So what we're doing now is it's still back to the detail now that I've got the upper part of the motor finished. I've mixed up kind of a steel gray. There's some sort of tag there on the top. I don't know if it's a VIN number. I don't know if they had VIN numbers way back then, or if it's a serial number, if Harley did serial numbers and where they put them. So if anyone's up on old J-style Harleys, I know I can ask Retrocycle over in New York, and I'm sure they would fill me in on that. So the tag is definitely a different metal than the rest of it that's attached to, and there's small numbers or letters engraved. I can't really make out the numbers or letters. It doesn't really matter at the scale anyway. So this same deal with the other details in that I can put the brighter highlights on here now because the airbrush work that's going to come in after is pretty specific. It's not just like a general shading that goes over everything, and which would wipe all those highlights out. So it allows me to kind of put in those sharper, whiter, or lighter details in before the airbrush. The airbrush is going to come into play in this episode, where it didn't in the last one. The last one was mainly putting in all those sharper edges and things like that. So these control rods, they are very shiny, so they get that bluish, grayish highlight. So whatever steel they're made out of didn't really oxidize the same way as the yellow, more yellow parts. So this gets that brighter highlight. And again, I'm going to be putting airbrushing on this to kind of blend them in, so I can be kind of generous with the highlights. In fact, it's a good idea to be a little bit more aggressive with the highlights here because they will be airbrushed on top of. Now that doesn't mean that I can't go back in and pop in a few brighter highlights, but you know, it's nice to be able to kind of just roll in, you know. I think, yeah, this highlight here is not as bright as the one above, and it should have a little bit more blue in it, but do I do that? It's so weird seeing me painting when I know what's coming and also look at it with a different eye. It's kind of interesting doing these voiceovers. You know, I left it just kind of bright, bright white. Okay. I just painted this too. It wasn't an hour ago that I did this video. So hopefully I'll be able to recall a lot of the amazing words of wisdom that I forgot to have the microphone on for. And again, I said this in the last episode, I really love doing this part. This is like it really is the frosting on the cake. It has the biggest impact right away. You know, these bright highlights pop things forward and the really sharp darks really kind of recede. So here is the highlight on that tag that's just basically straight up white. Yeah, good call. I was about to use that bright white highlight on the yellowish part, and that would have been crazy bright. So I just toned that down a little bit. And again, a lot of this bike is worn and beat up and pebbled and all that fun stuff. So the highlights are not like obviously on a bright shiny car where they're super slick and hard edge. They have a lot of texture in them too. Yeah, I'm talking about the rubber on that. It's interesting, and I really got to make sure I'm in the right mindset when I do that. because it has a really old, worn feel, and I gotta kind of figure it out and make sure I do it the right way. So those little, again, highlights on those little fasteners, whatever they are, nuts or, and then there's some, hidden highlights, or not really even highlights. They're just kind of brighter areas that are inside the motor, knowing that I'll be hitting those with the airbrush. That's why they're so bright. It's okay. Yeah, more of the highlights. Clearly, see how cartoony that piece looks because it's basically outlined and has, those bright areas on it. That'll all get toned down too. So this is all about, the blocking in. So when you block in, you have these big areas with no details, and this is what it is now. It's being able to go back in and add in all those details on those blocked in simple parts. And for me, it's fun. It's like when I'm blocking things in, I really want to get to the details, but it's a patience thing. Okay, so this lower rod here is pretty straight, and the way I have it airbrushed in, it's not. So I'm going to use this little ruler trick to kind of paint in that. But of course, the paint is too dry, so gotta re-wet the brush a little bit. I did mention in this, I don't know where I learned this from. I wish I did. I don't know if I saw someone do it, or if I just kind of picked it up, or if it's just a residual drafting thing. But the ability to paint a straight line with a ruler is just fantastic with a paintbrush. Something you wouldn't necessarily think of, but I use that trick a lot. All right, so a darker gray, I'm thinking there's more details that are tucked in, and yeah, that's what it is. So these are still technically highlights, but if you see how dark that gray is on the palette, and then I added a little bit down in the corner too. I lightened that up because the repair I did at the end of the last episode, see how dark that is in the very corner? The paint dried a little bit darker than I intended, so you just grab a little bit of lighter paint and add it in there and clean it up. I know I'll have to fix that again. It's just, it is what it is. Okay, so there's a spot right above. You can actually see the background through. It's a little triangle, so that's what I'm kind of putting in right now. It's not part of the pedal there, the pedal, the pad there. It's just in the background. So, and darker colors. So again, here's it's like a dark gray. So this is the shadow of that little tag. And again, the brush is on the drier side so that it doesn't flood out. And that's how you get those really, really like super fine lines. The brush dries out much quicker. So you see how it just, I only got the front end of that and then it just dried out. So you have to repalette the brush a lot, but it's the only way to get those really, really tight lines. That was too wet, so it actually flooded out on that side. It's not a big deal, but that's the difference there. So, and then I'm just kind of putting little tick marks for the numbers and letters or whatever it is there. Other details that are kind of in there as well, edges, and again, it's 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 nice to be able to use that, like that's that dark gray color. By incorporating that in different areas around the bike painting, especially in one local area, it really helps to tie things together. So using that same color in different areas. I'm always paletting the brush. So you palette on the palette itself, It's basically what paletting is working the paint into the bristles of the brush evenly, and then sometimes there's too much paint in there, so you have to palette it off to the side, say on a drier surface. And that just really gets everything smooth and even in the bristles so that it points that brush and gets it ready for those details. Lots of that gray. I like that gray. That seems to be a little bit more black too. So now I'm getting those really sharp, darker details. And again, I can't say how much I love opaque black from Createx. It has a little bit of a warm brownish cast to it, which it didn't before. It was more of a bluish paint. So I find I use that color a lot, the black, and straight out of the bottle, I'll just reduce it and go. The brown is so neutral in a way that it can work with so many different other colors, which is great. I love it. Where when it's more blue, it tends to be cooler, and then you kind of adjust it if you use it on you know, a warmer surface, but this just seems to cover, it could cover all the bases. All right, so more of a flesh tone now. Again, that's burnt sienna, and this is going to be the highlights on these little connecting bolts here, pivot bolts. Again, they seem really, really harsh. They're going to be kind of softened up when get the airbrush rolling in a few. We're coming down to this though, man. Again, I can't really tell you how many more episodes. It depends on how long it takes to do that rubber on the pad. The next episode is going to be probably the worn metal around that, and then the very last thing we'll do is the rubber, and that'll kind of close out this painting. And I'm pretty sure right now what I'm doing is I'm getting the airbrush ready, because that's, I believe, how I ended this episode. Yep, yeah, there we go. Just grabbing the brush. Now my Micron B, I was talking about this. The Micron B was giving me a little bit of a hassle. Not a hassle. I went away last week, or the time doesn't really line up with when I record these. But anyway, I was away and I let the brushes. They were clean, but they hadn't been used for a week. And what happens when you don't use a brush? Any residual paint in there sets up and really, really dries in there. So there were a couple things that were going on. One, I needed to really kind of flush these things out. And even after that, they were kind of funky. They weren't really working quite right. Now, sometimes just by using it, you get it back. It just kind of does its job. That's what I'm doing right now. So there's paint in the front end of that brush. So I just remove the handle and I'm going to kind of move the needle around inside and, push it forward gently and just kind of loosen up whatever paint is in there. The nice thing about the reducers now is they kind of break down the paint as well, not like a cleaner does. Well, 4012 does, but the 4011 doesn't. But it's still, it will pull paint off the inside as you use the brush. So just by default, if you use the brush often, it'll always stay kind of working really well. If you let them sit for a while, then the paint becomes very permanent. And that's its job. After 24 hours of just total evaporation, the paint becomes very, very strong. And that happens in the airbrush too. So you got to really keep up with it. The other thing that's going on with this, the Micron, and I talk about it in a little bit, is I'm talking about it right now, there is a vacuum leak in the front end of the airbrush. And all that is, there's just a tiny, tiny bit of air that's allowed to kind of creep in the head of the airbrush somewhere. And what that does is it causes the paint to skip, but very slightly and almost like a machine gun. It gets to be a machine gun when it's really bad, when it's really compromised. But in this brush, the tolerances are so tight, it could just be a tiny, tiny gap, like a microscopic gap. But of course, air is also microscopic, so the air can get in. And then it causes these really fine bubbles to appear in the brush. And it also interrupts the spray or confuses the spray in a way. It makes it just skip a little bit. And again, on a big, t-shirt brush or something like that, you'll never notice that because you're pumping out so much paint and there's so much air. But on a brush like this, it's really putting out a small amount of paint and a small amount of air. You start to notice that. So Medea came out with a beeswax that's made by a company that's local to them in Portland, and it comes in like a chapstick container. And I don't know where I got a tube of it, um, but I'd always use straight up beeswax, and straight up beeswax is hard. It's like a candle, but harder than a candle. And to use it on an airbrush works great, but you gotta warm it up. You gotta, it's just difficult to use because it's such a hard, stiff material. This beeswax thread sealer that Wada developed with this company is just right. It's like it's permanently warm. It, not it's temperature wise, but the consistency wise. It's a little bit softer because it's got some oils in it. It's just right. So I was using that and then I lost it. I don't think I lost it. I think I might have given it away to someone. Um, but anyway, I got to get more of it. So that's a super long story about how I need to reseal the end of my airbrushes, and there you go. But yeah, if you're having difficulty with your airbrush, it doesn't seem to be working quite right. It's shooting like a machine gun, it's bubbling back in the cup. A lot of times that compromise in vacuum. If it really bubbles back and it blows back in the brush, that's usually the nozzle cap or the needle cap at the very end. Nozzle cap, sorry, is blocked and the air just can't get out, so it's being forced back into the cup. But that really fine, microscopic, like teeny weeny bubbles consistently in the cup means there's a vacuum problem. But see, even at this brush, not quite working right, it still works amazing. It's like a race car driver, when they go around the track a couple times and they give the crew chief those minor little things to improve to make the car run even better. That's what we're talking about with this. It's not a, oh my gosh, I have to tear everything down kind of moment. It's just a, you know, micro change, I guess. So now we're back into the airbrush. It's 1 to 10 mix in this, so it's super reduced. 1 part paint to 10 parts reducer. And again, doing this makes the paint extremely fragile on the surface. I really only use this to tint paint that's already on the surface. And that's what allows it to hold on. Don't get me wrong, I could still scratch it and erase it, but once I get the clear on, it'll sandwich it all together and it's, good forever, but it's very fragile. But it's what allows me to get this brush to do stuff like a paintbrush, as small as a paintbrush. It's also the reason that I can put in those highlights and not worry about it. In fact, I want to put them in so that I can do things like what I'm doing right now. And that's kind of rolling around those highlights to kind of blend them in, get that paintbrushy type feel off of them. Like on the bottom of this rod right now. So that'll blend up into that highlight that I painted in there, especially near the back side, near the side I'm working on right now. So on this bike, there aren't that many instances where I'd have to airbrush the bright highlights, to put like a real reduced white on a, shiny vehicle, that's a different story. So on a vehicle or something that's really shiny and bright, there are a lot of instances where the next step or the step right before this would be to do the same airbrushing on the bright highlights to kind of soften them up. In this instance, because the bike is so worn and the highlights really aren't that bright, I don't have to reintroduce the white into the highlights. In fact, I don't want to. If I were to use the white on any of these brighter highlights, it would make them glow like they were shining, and certainly that's not going on this bike. Again, smiling as I'm watching this because this is really my favorite part. I love doing this stuff. I love the tightening up and getting in really close and really doing all that blending between the paintbrush and the airbrush. When I get to the point where it's like I can't really tell which one I used, that's when I know it's right. When it's no longer a paintbrush stroke or no longer an airbrush stroke, it's somewhere in between. That's what we're looking for. So those highlights that are right in there, I'm going to kind of gently go over those with a really, soft spray of black and see how it kind of tucks them back in there. They still have that really sharp edge to them, but now they're not as bright. So for me, it's all personal preference on how you like to do it. I could have mixed a darker gray, uh, darker gray paint to do those two little highlights that I just painted over and just painted them in at the actual value. But I enjoy like adjusting the value with the airbrush. So I'll frequently paint things in brighter than they're going to be ultimately and then adjust them with the airbrush. I really like painting that way. Again, there's a million ways to do this and it's just the way that I enjoy and is most comfortable for me. So keep that in mind too. There's many ways to get this done. I think, yeah, I'm talking about the bubbles now. So all that vacuum stuff is what I'm kind of going over now. And I think there's a moment in this, if I remember right, from an hour ago, where I kind of show you the bubbles in the cup. And they are super small. They are tiny, tiny. So I got to get my order in, get new thread sealant. Again, you can literally use any kind of wax to do that. I've even used like Yankee Candle wax. Um, it's just that when it's formulated to seal threads, it's a little bit easier to manage. Like I said, if you get raw beeswax, it can be a little bit more of a challenge to deal with and get because the idea is you need to seal all the threads. So if you're having a hard time getting the wax into all the threads because the wax is too hard or if it's too soft and it doesn't do the job, that's you're still going to have problems where the thread sealant that Iwata made was really, really nice. Before we used to get, I don't know if they still use it, but in the Japanese factory where they make the Iwatas, they use this red thread sealant. And I remember talking to one of the Iwata techs at one point, and I'm like, "Can you please, tell me what this stuff is? It's great." And it was funny. He just said, "No, if I told you, we'd have to kill you." So I don't know what they use at the factory, but it's great stuff. If I don't know if it's the same now, but it used to be red, so you could always tell when the sealant was on it. Adam was his name at Iwata. That was way back. That was like in the 2000s, early 2000s. So here it is, again, that thin black kind of put in over the whole area that needs to be darkened. This area red in here too, same thing. Just kind of push that back. It's nice. It's fun. It's almost like reverse, or no, it's like sculpting. You need to take material away. So instead of taking material away to deepen something, to tuck it in, you just use paint. The darker it is, the more tucked in it is, the deeper it goes. Okay, so what I'm going to do now, there's a edge on this frame piece here that is too light, right there I'm pointing. So I'm just going to use the airbrush to kind of sharpen that edge. Right on the background too, see how it's kind of brownish there too? That's something I should also fix. That's overspray from the frame on the background. I'm going to kind of judge that as the painting goes along. If it's not overly annoying, I may just leave it. It might be one of those things that I leave. The reason being, sometimes if you try to fix something, you'll make it a lot worse than what it is. So, um, yeah. So that was it. You just hit it a couple times. I used a piece of paper, straight edge piece of paper, as a shield real quick, and just lock that in. I didn't realize I was off camera view. That's what happens a lot with the camera being so close. It isn't really. I have a great macro lens. This camera's probably about 2.5 feet away, but the macro lens is so good. But again, your field is much smaller, so it's easier for me if I'm not paying attention, getting all excited and getting into it that I don't realize I'm off the camera. So, but you get the idea. I'll figure it out in a minute. I mean, it's not like I didn't turn on the mic or anything. God. I know that I end this video with fixing or finishing fixing the shadow too, so I know I do pull it up eventually. But here you go, you get the idea. So this is that black being tucked in, and also, near those gray, mini highlights inside, it's nice to be able to kind of darken them up. So here I'm just taking the black and repairing the edges. Again, I talked about this before. This is an ongoing thing, especially that bottom edge really takes a lot of like abuse because I'm resting my hands on there. On the wheel, it's really easy to fix though because there's a lot going on there. So I can just kind of float in the black a little bit and it fixes it right away. If it was a real smooth area like to the right where the background is, if that was scuffed, that'd be a different repair because you can't just spray in some light gray because you'll see it. So thankfully that's not damaged. All right, to the shadow. So the end of this, I've done all the, oh, I'm going to show you the bubbles now. I'm going to change the exposure on the camera and focus it so you can see it. So those bubbles, the way, there we go, Steve. And then focus it, and we should be good. Yeah, see those little highlights? Those are all bubbles. And see how small they are? That's this little micro bubble that will just pop up from the inside of the brush and get forced back in. And that's caused from that compromise in the vacuum up front. Again, that's the two different ways you can get bubbles in your cup. You can get bubbles in your cup if the vacuum is not quite right. And the other way you can get them again is that if that little nozzle cap at the very end has got paint or blockage on it, not letting air out. The big difference is when the nozzle cap is blocked, you'll get a lot of air. To the point of if that gets completely blocked, you'll be wearing paint. But when the vacuum is broken, even just slightly, you'll get these little bubbles that will appear very regularly while you're spraying, especially at the beginning of if you push down for air and then start to pull back very slightly, that's when you get the bubbles. If you pull it back very far, that increases the flow of air and the paint and everything, and the vacuum that compromise doesn't really have the same effect because so much air is moving out of the brush, it doesn't matter. But it's really when you just first start to pull the trigger back. And the way to really see that is not with paint, but with something thinner like water, or if you're using rubbing alcohol to clean, or just reducer. If the material is really thin, it'll allow those bubbles to pass through and you'll see them. So again, the quick, easy solution to that is just get some thread sealant. And I'd recommend the Iwata stuff because it works so well. But again, you can use any kind of thread sealant. Obviously, don't use anything that locks threads, please, or else you'll weld your airbrush shut, and you know you don't want to be doing that. So it's better, again, it's not about lasting very long either. It takes 2 seconds to reapply wax, and it's okay if it doesn't last forever. I'd rather be reapplying it than have something that's like, again, welding my airbrush together. We don't want that. What I really hope is that I refocus the camera on the painting. But it's a shadow, so hopefully if I don't refocus it, it's you'll still get the idea. Jeebus, I don't think I did refocus it. Oh, there we go. Good job, Steve. Good job. All right, so I've still got black in the brush. It's still really thin. So again, this is just taking off the last of the curse of that repair. By using a little bit of black, it now reintroduces the airbrush into that and blends out any of the paintbrush kind of work that I did to fix that. This shadow is much, much, much darker in the reference photo, and it's not going to be that way in the painting. I like the lighter shadow underneath. It just sets the motorcycle off a lot better than the really super dark shadow that's in the reference. But I really like the shapes. I love that there were multiple light sources to kind of create these different shapes. It's not just the bike underneath it. So probably one of the smartest unintentional things I did with this shadow was not make it too dark from the start. By leaving it really light allows me to do what I'm doing right now. So I did that repair, and now I can darken a little bit and get rid of those scratches, and everything still reads the right way. A little bit of black underneath the wheel. Again, you can't just do this in one spot of the shadow. So I introduced that black everywhere and then in the shadow. And then it looks like it was done that way from the start. Again, it's unintentional kind of thing that is forced to be intentional. Yay. Excellent. There we go. So that is kind of the episode. We got a few things to do left. Next episode is going to be kind of the rest of the shiny bits on the lower controls, and I know I'll be getting in. There we go. And then I know I'll be getting into that pad in the last episode too. So I think it's probably going to take 2 or 3 episodes to do the rubber. I'm guessing it may not, but it might. But after that, I mean, we're almost done. So here we go. So again, I'm Steve Leahy. Thank you so much for joining, for hanging out, for commenting and subscribing and liking and doing all those YouTubey things that you do. You're about to see the list of Patreon members and YouTube members. Again, thank you so much to all of you. That type of thing is really what's keeping this whole content flood going. So I really love that you guys are into it. So thank you very much. All right, I will catch you all the next time, and yeah, have a great week.